West Africa's second largest economy, I beg your pardon, is going through extremely tough times. Now, once described by the World Bank as Africa's shining star, Ghana had the world's fastest growing economy in 2019 after it doubled its economic growth. But today, it is no longer the economic poster boy of West Africa. Now, despite being a major cocoa and gold exporter, it is currently battling its worst financial crisis in decades. While focus has mainly been on President Nana Akufo-Addo and Finance Minister Ken Ofori-Atta's handling of the situation, the Bank of Ghana's governor, Ernest Addison, is now in the hot seat, with protesters demanding he resign for what they say is the mismanagement of the economy during the worst debt crisis in a generation. The demonstrations are the latest show of frustration with rising living costs, joblessness, and hardship in Ghana. Joining me now is Patrick Baah Abankwa, financial analyst and investment advisor. Patrick, welcome back to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me on your show.
All right, fantastic. Now let's start with the data. So what the data is telling us is that government debt to GDP ratio for Ghana currently stands at 98.72%, and it's expected to reach at least 99% by the end of this year. Public debts, which also excludes state-owned enterprises' obligations, rose to about 569.3 billion cedis, around $49.7 billion at the end of April. So what is the blame for these negative indices? Because right now it seems there's a lot of finger pointing going on. Is it misguided policies, or are we talking about the domestic and global shocks that have affected Ghana's economy like they've affected many African economies? Where do you think we should be looking?
Okay, I think the factors that have brought us to this point are, for me, not just one side of the equation. So you mentioned misguided policies, which I agree. I agree because government over the period, the last 7 years, has invested and expanded the public sector to the point that every year, the backlog of teachers and nurses that were there from previous administration, they've tried to employ most of them, which has expanded the public sector. And the more you expand the public sector, the more it adds to a toll on the revenue of the country. In Ghana, when you take off the revenues that we get as a country and you pay interest on loans or debts that the government owes, the next biggest expenditure is the public sector. So the more you increase intake of people into the public sector because of the rate of unemployment, it puts a bit of toll on you. And that's why the previous government at some point had to put a stop or halt on the recruitment of people into the public sector. Again, some removal of subsidies on the oil sector and some other sector has also contributed to what I call as a misguided policies, especially when we saw the impact happening from 2020 and 2021. The government should have perhaps taken some steps to be able to measure its expectations around this level. On the domestic shocks, of course, Ghana has also been affected by the issue of COVID-19, as you said, not just in Ghana, other African countries have also been affected. And these shocks have led to a decline in the economic growth of the country. Before COVID, Ghana was growing around 8%, 9% by way of GDP. After COVID, the growth that we've experienced is sometimes below even 2%. It means that the economy is not growing enough to be able to get the revenue to do the project that the government is doing. Globally, too, we can talk of the issue of rising costs of food and oil that has affected every country, and Ghana is not an exception. There has been an upward pressure of inflation and exchange rate within the same period, and has made it even very difficult for government to be able to pay its loans, because now the little that the government is making, because the currency has depreciated, it has to now get more local currency to be able to pay these debts. So for me, it's not just the policies of the government, but we can also talk of the domestic shocks and also the global shocks, which together have come together to put a bit of pressure on the Ghanaian economy as we speak.
Let's talk about some of those decisions, because in terms of the data, again, the debt stock has increased by about 93 billion Ghana cedis this year alone due to the depreciation of the cedis since the beginning of 2022. Now, some would ask, could the government have reduced its debt portfolio by borrowing less at that time, especially knowing fully well that there were issues ahead of them, that the figures were hitting the ceiling without any concrete revenue growth being seen?
Yeah, so I think that the government made an error by assuming that by putting in place some measures after COVID, we're going to see an instant growth in the economy. And that growth meant that revenue was going to also go up. But these measures that they put in place have not yet materialized. And that means that even though government's expenditure keeps on rising, the revenue bit is not matching up the growth of the expenditure that is growing. And for me, that is where government should have taken its time, especially some policies that they already implemented. Let's take, for example, government every year incurs so much money to look after our junior ones in the senior high school or the secondary level. Over the last 7 years, government has spent so much money in terms of supporting these schools. This is a situation whereby our revenue base is not growing. And if revenue base is not growing, it's such a policy, should you continue to incur so much money to the point that you now have to go into the capital market, the domestic market to borrow just to be able to get enough to pay public sector workers and also be able to engage yourself in some infrastructure projects? For me, these are things that government should have halted the numerous policies that they were implementing to be able to manage the situation, for the situation to be better before they go ahead with more spending. And the more you spend, the more you also incur so much cost in terms of the interest that you need to pay on the borrowings that you are making.
All right, so let's drill down now to the Bank of Ghana governor. So in July, the Ghana Central Bank reported a record loss of 60.8 billion cedis. That's about $5.3 billion for 2022, primarily due to debt restructuring. And in response to the crisis, Ghana, which is known for its production of gold, oil, and cocoa, has also entered into a $3 billion three-year loan program with the International Monetary Fund. Now, walk us through this loss that is now being held against the Bank of Ghana governor. This in particular has been one that has been causing a lot of controversy in Ghana.
Yes, so the central bank loss, as you rightly said, about 60.8 billion in 2020 was just because they had to write off some debts of the government. When government borrows money from the central bank, it creates money. It means government needs money to engage in some developmental project. But when this is done, it leads to inflation, and which can sometimes erode central bank's profit. Now, as you are rightly aware, most of the banks in Ghana, because they entered into the domestic debt exchange program, most of them had to write off the bonds that they had with government by way of losses. Same applies to the central bank, because they also gave some monies to the central government. And because there is no clear plan on how central government is going to pay this money that the Bank of Ghana gave out, the Bank of Ghana, by accounting principles, had to write them off. And once you write it off, it counts back to you as a loss. And that led to the big loss that we saw from Bank of Ghana based on their report that they shared last year, 2022. And for me, if care is not taken, I know that as part of the conditions before IMF took over, it was one of the things that they mentioned, that central bank had to take off some of these debts that they owe to government to be able to get a bit of space to be able to raise more revenue. So that was a condition from IMF, and the expectation is that once IMF program has taken off, the decision that they took will lead to stabilizing the economy and perhaps begin to improve the fiscal discipline of the country.
So you're actually leading me right into my next question, because it was in April that Ernest Addison announced that the central bank and the finance ministry had signed this zero financing agreement, which was basically saying that the central bank would end lending to the government, and was also expected to take effect when the IMF board approved Ghana's loan program. That loan program was approved on May 17th. In terms of the expected impact, you talked about the impact at the end of that statement just now. Are we seeing the intended impact of this agreement? Has there also been seen any way in which this has also affected the Bank of Ghana's bottom line? What do you think?
I think the agreement has not yet given us the significant impact that we expect, both from the central bank bottom line and also Ghana as a whole. We need to understand that when it comes to economic growth and changes in the economy, it takes a bit of time. So the positive impact that we are expecting by way of Bank of Ghana having good health, financial health, for me, we will take a bit of time. And in taking a bit of time, we also need to see a bit of financial discipline and fiscal discipline from central bank to be able to ensure that the plan that we've put in place with IMF begins to yield the desired result. For me, we signed it up in April. As we speak, we are in October. It's a bit too early to see the real impact, even though some policies of central bank in terms of the interest rate that they increase on treasury bills have begun to impact on the economy, because we've seen the inflation dropping down from the 50 that we experienced last year to now, which is a bit lower and improved from last 2 months. So for me, it's something that we have to take a bit of time to see the impact. But as we are taking the time, as I said, government of Ghana, Bank of Ghana should begin to also employ a bit of fiscal discipline to some of the things that they are agreeing with IMF, so that the economy will begin to take shape maybe from next year onwards.
Interesting you mentioned fiscal discipline, and when I asked you about the losses that the Bank of Ghana had incurred, you made mention of creating money, and that's one of the allegations right now that the Bank of Ghana governor is also facing. So he's accused of printing about 80 billion Ghana cedis to support the government without Parliament's approval. So Patrick, what do you know about this allegation? Where does this particular situation stand?
So I believe this allegation started somewhere beginning of last year, 2022, where we had the ranking member of the parliament in terms of the minority making this allegation that Bank of Ghana was printing. At the time, it was even 22 billion. And they said that Bank of Ghana was not doing the right thing by way of getting approval from Parliament. But Bank of Ghana came out strongly to issue a communique on July 26, if I can recall, 2022. And in the communication, they made reference to an appendix of the mid-year budget review. And they said that the mid-year fiscal policy document, appendix 2A, they captured this particular monies that they gave to government by way of printing as part of the appendix that was in parliamentary document. And for that matter, according to them, the ranking member or the allegations are not founded because these amount that people are channeling around actually went through Parliament in various forms. Some of them went through Parliament by way of repayment of bonds that government owed that they needed to give the money back to them. Some has to do raising new money to be able to implement some fiscal policies and also support the financial sector. So these are things that, according to Bank of Ghana, were captured in the mid-year fiscal policy review document, which usually is submitted to the Parliament of Ghana, especially through the ranking committee that focuses on the budgetary allocations and also the financial part of our economy. So according to Bank of Ghana, these are things that had gone to the Parliament. And of course, I've seen the document, and this was actually captured in that document. But the breakdown was actually given not in relation to just giving money to the government, but also other repayment of bonds that they needed to do on behalf of government.
That's interesting. So let's go back to the data now. So according to data coming from the Bank of Ghana, the cedi's year-to-date depreciation stood at 22.1% as of July 21st of this year. It was 22.1 in March, then 21.7 in April, 21.8 in May, 22% in June, and of course leading to July. We also have food prices rising by 122% in 2022, and then fuel prices also soared as well. The unemployment rate in Ghana is expected to reach 4.64%. That's about 1.2 million people for this year. With all of these indices and the tight global conditions and the debt situation, what could the Bank of Ghana have done better or even differently? Earlier, we talked about assigning blame, but I'm very sure to say there's enough blame to go all around. But specific to the Bank of Ghana, under the management of Ernest Addison, what could they have done differently to address some of these issues, particularly on the monetary side of things? So I think, as we all know, in solving economic challenges, you look at the fiscal side, we look at the monetary. So the fiscal side, basically the central government, where we talk about taxes. And on the monetary side, we are talking about some policy in relation to monetary policy rate, treasury bill, and all of that. So let me focus on the central bank side, which is the monetary policy, as you rightly said. I believe that issues relating to raising the monetary policy rate is something that they should have done later part of last year. Starting it this year meant that we have lost a bit of months that we could have raised the monetary policy rate to be able to curb the rising inflation. Because somewhere last year, we started the year with an inflation just around, I think, 9% or 10% inflation. And at that time, we had treasury bill rate around 12%. And we saw that things were beginning to get tougher. And that's when I expected Bank of Ghana, through the governor, central bank, to be able to begin to increase the monetary policy rate. Once you increase monetary policy rate, it feeds off the monies in circulation. And once people do not have money in circulation and they rather channel their funds into investment, probably you begin to see that inflation will drop. And that's what I've said, that as they did that this year, we've seen inflation dropping at the moment. It means that if we had done this particular thing earlier than that,
we would have seen better improvement in the economy than today. But of course, this is something that goes beyond central bank. It's a holistic approach that we need in solving not just the monetary side, but also the fiscal side. So therefore, it's not fair on my part to blame all of this on the governor, the central bank governor, because as this issue requires sometimes concerted effort from various stakeholders, including government himself and the private sector. So for me, it's not just the central bank. They should have done something which I've said, which is the monetary policy that they should have increased somewhere last year. But beyond that, the fiscal policy is also lying straight on the doorstep of government and the private sector.
Okay, so interesting enough, last month, the Bank of Ghana governor said that improved economic indicators would soon lead to higher incomes and purchasing powers. Now, people are saying, where is he seeing those signs? So, Patrick, I want to ask you as well, are you seeing signs of this as well, of this sort of shift in fortunes for the economy and even Ghanaians? What do we know about where the purchasing power and higher incomes is expected to come from?
I would say it's too early to say whether the governor's prediction of improved economic indicators will lead to higher incomes and purchasing power, because as we speak, we are still facing a number of challenges, including high inflation. Even though I've said in the past that inflation has dropped, it's still quite high, which is eroding the purchasing power of people. And we still have issues relating to high unemployment rate. However, I think that Bank of Ghana's monetary policies are starting to have a positive impact by way of inflation dropping on the economy. And I've said that if that continues for a very long time, it will have a ripple effect on other side of the economy. So we need to give ourselves a bit of time. But the prediction that things are going to get better, for me, it is still premature. We are not yet there. The city, even though has stabilized for the last 6 months, we still expect more in terms of its impact on the real economy of the country.
Okay, and sometimes it's said that we as humans have short memories. So let's go down memory lane a little bit as we wrap up. And that means looking at Addison's 6-year spell as Bank of Ghana governor. So President Nana Akufo-Addo took power in January 2017, and Ernest Addison was appointed in April of 2017. Inflation seemed to have come down significantly, particularly when he took over at the BOG. Under the previous government, it was 15.4% in 2016, and then it fell to 7.9% by the end of 2019, and also remained in the single digits until the pandemic hit in March of 2020. He was also governor when the World Bank described Ghana as Africa's shining star. And I remember having conversations on Business Edge as to how Ghana came out of the pandemic almost better than any other economy in sub-Saharan Africa. But what we've seen is a dramatic and drastic turnaround from that point in time. So what's your assessment of the monetary policies, economic reforms, and even the overall management of Ghana's monetary space under Addison? Now he's under fire, but we can remember when he was being hailed as the man who was at the helm of some of the magnificent changes that Ghana was experiencing.
Yeah, so Dr. Addison's spell as a governor, for me, has some mixed feelings around it. On one hand, as you rightly said, he has been credited with bringing inflation down from double digits to single digits. On the other hand, he has also been criticized for his handling of the debt crisis. Overall, I would say that Dr. Addison's management of the monetary space has, for me, if I'm to give you between 1 and 10, I would say about 6, because the challenges that we actually face from 2022 coming up to this point, for me, were things that some of them were not within his space. Because if government is cut off, or Ghana is as a country is cut off from the capital market, I don't think that you can blame the central bank for Ghana being cut off from the capital market, because our debt was getting to a point which was not sustainable. It's important to know that the economy is a complex system, as you all know, and there's no single person or group of individuals who will be responsible for its overall performance. The government has a stake in it, as I've rightly said. The central bank has a stake, which is the monetary policy. The businesses in the country have a stake. Consumers all play a role in shaping the economy. So it's important that we consider the global economic environment, which can also have a significant impact on Ghana's economy. So all of these things, for me, should come together to make a final determination of whether Dr. Addison has done well or not. But for me, if I'm to grade him, as I said, I'll give him 6/10, because things that he did in the past, which brought inflation down, which made our currency stable, are things that if we didn't have global shocks and government did not also continue to borrow without any breaks, perhaps we could have come back to a very good position as we speak today. But let's just see the way forward in terms of the policy and its impact going forward. For me, I think that if government is disciplined, expenditure is reduced, we are able to structure the fundamentals of our economy in terms of agriculture, services industry, we focus more on manufacturing, then the economy of Ghana will begin to pick up again in spite of the challenge that we have faced in the last 24 months.
He has about, I think, 2 years left on his tenure. Patrick, do you think he will survive the financial crisis that Ghana itself is going through? Because oftentimes we might find people who don't make it through the crisis, don't make it through that storm and come out at the other end of the tunnel.
You see, when it comes to the governor of the central bank, normally if the governor has the backing of the president, they usually stay and they're able to go through the storm. Indications clearly show that the president has so much faith in the governor. So I think that he will sail through these turbulent times. As whether beyond 2024, which is our election year, he will still be there. That will have to leave for posterity to judge. But I think that the president will back him in this particular instance and hope that things will improve as himself, the Minister for Finance, and also other stakeholders begin to put their heads together through IMF to bring the economy back to its track.
That this is a conversation we've been following very closely and one we'll continue to follow here on Business Edge. Patrick Baah, Abankwa, thank you so much for your time today. Financial analyst and investment advisor, as we look at the Bank of Ghana governor being under fire with these 3-day protests and now possibly going into another day as people are complaining about rising cost of living, joblessness, and of course, rising food prices and much more. Thank you so much, Patrick. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you, sir.
All right. So we have international business headlines coming up for you. And after that, a conversation about the impact of currency devaluations on remittance to Africa. But of course, that comes up after a break. Stay with us.